In the grim ledgers of American history, some tales are intentionally left unwritten, their ink too black, their truths too corrosive for the clean pages of accepted memory. The story of the woman from Rebecca is one such account, a chilling footnote from 1832 that speaks not of spectral hauntings or demonic possessions, but of a far more tangible horror. It concerns a quiet widow who, under the cloak of piety and civic duty, appointed herself the town's silent executioner. She became a predator of the vulnerable, hunting and killing Irish immigrants in the sanctity of their sleep, a methodical slaughter fueled by a hatred that the town itself had nurtured in its heart. If the shadows of the past hold more truth for you than the celebrated light of history, and you have only just found this archive, subscribe and join our vigil over the stories that refuse to be buried. The year was 1832, and the town of Rebecca was a place that clung to its own certainties, like a man gripping a Bible in a tempest. It was a settlement carved from the unforgiving timber and stone of the New World, a place where survival was a daily sacrament and suspicion was as common as prayer. The air, thick with the perpetual scent of wood smoke and damp earth, seemed to carry the weight of the town's collective anxieties. Rebecca was not a place of open arms. It was a closed fist, knuckles white, guarding what little it had against the encroaching wilderness and the ceaseless tide of unfamiliar faces. The houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows like narrowed eyes, watching the muddy artery of the main road. The church steeple, the town's only real claim to height, did not so much pierce the sky as it seemed to nail the sullen, gray expanse in place, a constant reminder of judgment. The people of Rebecca were forged in this same mold, hard, unyielding, and deeply wary of anything that did not reflect their own image. They were a people who equated difference with danger and novelty with threat. Their conversations were clipped, their smiles rare and fleeting, reserved for those whose grandparents were buried in the same cold soil. Into this sealed vessel of fear and provincialism, a new element was about to be introduced, one that would prove to be the catalyst for a horror that none would ever openly admit to, but which would stain the town's soul for generations. The news arrived not as a formal announcement, but as a rumor carried on the wind, a whisper that passed from the general store to the smithy, from the tavern to the pews. A ship was coming, a ship filled with the Irish. They arrived as the autumn light began to fail, spilling from the belly of a battered vessel named the Stout Mary onto the damp wooden docks of Rebecca's small, struggling port. They were not an invading army, but a scattered collection of families, their faces pale and etched with the twin hardships of starvation and a brutal sea voyage. They were a people hollowed out by loss, their eyes holding the ghost of a green land they would never see again. The men, thin but with frames that spoke of hard labor, carried what little they owned in burlap sacks. The women, wrapped in shawls the color of ash, clutched their children, their bodies forming a fragile barricade against the cold. Curious stares of the locals who had gathered to watch the disembarking. The air was thick with the smell of brine and wet wool, punctuated by the sharp, racking coughs of the youngest children, a sound that seemed to amplify the profound vulnerability of their situation. One man, whose name was Kian, held the hand of his small daughter, Una. In his other hand, he clutched a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched in a silent, permanent state of flight. He had carved it during the long, dark weeks at sea, a small token of beauty and promise for a child who had known neither. It was a simple, humanizing detail, a testament to a father's love in a world that had offered them little else. He looked at the town of Rebecca, at the stern, unsmiling faces that lined the dock, and his grip on his daughter's hand tightened. He had been told this was a land of opportunity, a place to build a new life, but the welcome he felt was as cold and unyielding as the gray water that slapped against the pilings. The people of Rebecca watched the newcomers with a silence that was more damning than any shouted insult. They saw not families seeking refuge, but a tide of destitution that threatened to swamp their fragile prosperity. They saw mouths to feed in a time of scarcity, foreign tongues that would corrupt their children, and a desperate faith that they viewed as a perversion of their own austere piety. The suspicion was a palpable thing, an invisible wall that rose between the established townsfolk and the ragged immigrants. In the days that followed, this suspicion curdled into a quiet, simmering resentment that permeated every interaction. The Irish families, housed in hastily constructed shacks on the marshy outskirts of town, found themselves in a state of cultural quarantine. When an Irish woman, She O'Bon, entered the general store, her coin as good as any other, conversations would falter and die. The proprietor, a man named Obadiah, would serve her last, his movements slow and deliberate, his face a mask of strained politeness. He would handle her money as if it were contaminated, his fingertips barely grazing the coins before sweeping them into his till. The local children, mimicking the prejudices of their parents, would fall silent in their games when the Irish children passed, their jeers and taunts waiting until the newcomers were just out of earshot. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted at night. Curtains that had been opened to the morning sun were now drawn tight, shielding the homes of Rebecca from the sight of the outsiders. The hostility was not confined to these subtle acts of social ostracism. It found its voice in the two places where the men of Rebecca gathered to speak their minds: the dim, ale-soaked confines of the tavern and the sanctified air of the churchyard after Sunday service. In the tavern, under the emboldening influence of drink, the whispers grew louder. Men like Thaddeus, a farmer whose land had yielded a poor harvest that year, would speak of the Irish as a blight. He said they were lazy and prone to drink, that they would steal the work from the hands of honest men. He claimed they brought with them the diseases of the old world, a filth that would poison the town's wellsprings. His words, though slurred with ale, found fertile ground in the anxieties of his neighbors. They nodded in agreement, their fears given shape and form by his resentful pronouncements. They spoke of the newcomers as if they were a singular entity, a monstrous organism that threatened to consume their way of life. The conversations were a litany of grievances, a self-reinforcing chorus of fear and loathing. They said the Irish bred like rabbits, that their shacks would soon multiply and spread like a cancer across the landscape. They muttered that their strange, guttural language was the sound of conspiracy, that their Catholic rituals were a form of devil worship performed in the shadows. Each rumor, no matter how baseless, was accepted as fact, another log thrown onto the pyre of their collective hatred. This simmering animosity was given a veneer of divine justification by the town's spiritual leader, Pastor Theron, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a mask of stern disapproval. Theron preached a gospel of exclusion. From his pulpit, he spoke of Rebecca as a blessed community, a bastion of righteousness in a fallen world. He warned his congregation of the dangers of corruption, of the insidious influence of foreign ways and false doctrines. He never named the Irish directly, but his meaning was as clear as the glass in his church windows. He spoke of those who come from lands of famine and faithlessness, and his words dripped with a righteous condemnation that his flock eagerly absorbed. He told them that God favored the industrious and the pious, and that poverty was a sign of moral failing. His sermons were carefully constructed parables of insiders and outsiders, of the saved and the damned. After the services, as the congregation gathered in the churchyard, the pastor's coded language was translated into more direct terms. The women of the town, led by wives like Sophronia and Huldah, would speak in hushed, worried tones, They said that the arrival of the immigrants was a test from God, a trial to see if the people of Rebecca would allow their pure community to be diluted by the spiritually unclean. They whispered that the coughing of the Irish children was not a symptom of sickness, but a manifestation of their inherent corruption. The church, which should have been a source of compassion, instead became an echo chamber for the town's deepest prejudices, sanctifying their fear and transforming it into a moral imperative. The Irish, for their part, endured this silent and spoken hostility with a stoicism born of long suffering. They had come to Rebecca not for acceptance, but for survival. The men sought work wherever they could find it, taking on the back-breaking, low-paying jobs that the locals disdained. They dug ditches, cleared land, and worked the docks, their bodies fueled by little more than weak tea and the thinnest of hopes. The women kept to their shacks, trying to create some semblance of a home in the damp, cramped quarters. They scrubbed, mended, and prayed, their faith a shield against the palpable animosity that surrounded them. They were acutely aware of the town's perception of them. They saw the suspicion in every averted gaze, heard the resentment in every clipped tone. They knew that in the eyes of the people of Rebecca, they were not individuals, not fathers and mothers and children, but a homogeneous threat. Kyan the woodcarver felt this most acutely. He had found work at the lumber mill, his skilled hands, which could coax the image of a soaring bird from a block of wood, now tasked with the brute labor of hauling and cutting timber. He worked in silence, ignored by the other men, his presence tolerated only because his labor was cheap. Each evening, he would return to his shack, his body aching, and look at his daughter, Una. He saw in her eyes the reflection of his own fading hope. The new life he had promised her felt more distant with each passing day. He had brought his family across an ocean to escape one form of hardship, only to find another waiting for them on this cold, unwelcoming shore. The town of Rebecca, which was supposed to be a refuge, had become another kind of prison, one with invisible bars of prejudice and fear. As the days shortened and the chill of winter began to seep into the bones of the land, the unease in Rebecca deepened. The collective fear of the townsfolk began to take on a more focused, more menacing shape. The general muttering and widespread suspicion started to coalesce, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The object of this intensified focus was not yet clear, but the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. The fear was no longer just a passive, background hum. It was becoming an active, watchful presence. The shadows in the town seemed to stretch longer, to cling more tightly to the corners of the buildings. The wind whistling through the bare branches of the trees sounded like a mournful whisper, carrying on it the premonition of a coming darkness. The hostility that had been simmering just beneath the surface was about to boil over. The town had created a perfect vessel for its hatred, filling it with fear, resentment, and a sense of righteous justification. All that was needed was a single hand to tip the vessel and let its poison spill out into the night. That hand belonged to a woman who had been watching, listening, and nursing her own private grief until it had twisted into a monstrous, obsessive rage. While the town had contented itself with whispers and averted gazes, she had been forging their collective animosity into a weapon. Her personal fixation was about to become the town's bloody secret, and the vulnerable, sleeping immigrants were her chosen target. The stage was set, the actors in their places, and the first act of a tragedy, written in the ink of prejudice and fear, was drawing to its close. The curtain of night was about to fall on Rebecca, and with it would come a horror that would forever haunt the town's waking dreams. In the geography of Rebecca's collective memory, one house stood apart, both in location and in spirit. It was situated at the town's southern edge, where the manicured severity of the settlement began to fray and surrender to the wild, untamed marshland. The house was a modest, two-story structure, its clapboard siding weathered to the color of old bone, the paint peeling away in long, leprous strips. A skeletal porch wrapped around its front, sagging in the middle as if it had sighed one day and never found the strength to straighten again. This was the home of the woman who would become the town's nameless terror. She was a fixture of Rebecca, as much a part of its landscape as the crooked steeple or the ancient oak in the town square, yet she existed in a state of profound and unsettling isolation. Her name was rarely spoken, not out of respect, but out of a kind of communal agreement to let her exist only in the periphery of their lives, a problem best left unexamined. She was a widow. This was the central, defining fact of her existence in the town's eyes. Her husband, Hezekiah, had been a stonemason, a man of quiet strength and calloused hands, whose work could be seen in the foundations of half the buildings in Rebecca. He had been killed 2 years prior, a casualty of his own trade. A derrick had failed, and a block of granite, destined for the new town hall, had crushed him in an instant. The town had mourned in its own clipped, reserved way. Pastor Theron had delivered a sermon on the inscrutable will of God, and the women had brought casseroles and pies to the widow's house for the prescribed period of 1 week. But after the earth had settled over Hezekiah's grave, a different kind of settling occurred. The town's pity, having fulfilled its social obligation, slowly receded, leaving the woman in a state of suspended grief from which she would never emerge. Before the accident, she had been known, if she was known at all, as a quiet but not unfriendly presence. She kept a small but vibrant garden, and it was said that her preserves were the finest in the county, a small, humanizing detail that was all but forgotten in the wake of what came later. She and Hezekiah had been a self-contained unit, their love a quiet, steady flame that required no audience. With his death, the flame was not just extinguished. It was as if the very air it had burned in was sucked from her world, leaving a vacuum that soon filled with something cold and corrosive. The first change the townsfolk noticed was her neglect of the very things that had once defined her. The garden, once a riot of color and life, was left to wither. Weeds choked out the last of the rose bushes, their thorny tendrils climbing the porch lattice like grasping, desperate fingers. The house itself seemed to absorb her sorrow, its windows growing dimmer, its structure seeming to slump further into the damp earth. She was seen less and less in town. Her trips to the general store became brief, silent affairs. She would enter like a ghost, her shopping list clutched in one hand, and she would gather her provisions without meeting anyone's eye. Her face, once pleasant, had become a mask of stone, her features sharpened by a grief that had calcified into a permanent state of severity. Rumors, the lifeblood of a town like Rebecca, began to attach themselves to her. Some said she spoke to her dead husband at night, her voice a low, insistent murmur that carried on the marsh wind. Others claimed to have seen her walking the fields at midnight, dressed in her funereal black, her form a stark silhouette against the moonlit landscape. These were, at first, the typical whispers that surround any figure of tragedy and seclusion. They were stories told to add a bit of morbid color to the drab fabric of daily life. But as the Irish arrived, the nature of the rumors began to change. They grew darker, more specific, and more aligned with the town's own burgeoning anxieties. The woman's strange, solitary behavior was no longer seen as a symptom of her grief, but as something more watchful, more purposeful. Her porch became her throne and her watchtower. As evening fell and the lamps were lit in the houses of Rebecca, she would take her place in a high-backed rocking chair, a piece of furniture so old and weathered that it seemed an extension of the decaying porch itself. The chair had been Hezekiah's. From this vantage point, She had a clear, unobstructed view across the low-lying marsh to the cluster of shacks where the immigrant families had been quartered, and she would watch. For hours, the creak of her rocking chair became a part of the nocturnal soundscape of that edge of town, a slow, rhythmic, and unnervingly steady metronome counting out the passing moments of the night. It was a sound that spoke of infinite patience, of a vigilance that never wavered. The moonlight, when it was full, would fall upon her, illuminating a face devoid of all softness. Her eyes were not the eyes of a woman lost in sorrowful memory. They were the eyes of a predator, narrowed and focused, scanning the shacks with an intensity that was terrifying in its single-mindedness. She watched the smoke curl from their chimneys. She watched the faint, flickering lamplight that seeped through the cracks in their walls. She memorized the comings and goings, the number of children in each family, the sound of their voices, and their strange, lilting music. To her, they were not people. In the crucible of her twisted grief, they had become something else entirely. Her husband was dead, his place in the world erased by a cruel and random act. Yet these strangers, these outsiders, were alive. They were multiplying. Their presence in her line of sight was a personal affront, an infestation upon the landscape of her sorrow. Her mind, untethered from the moorings of love and companionship, began to build a terrible, logical edifice of hatred. Hezekiah had built the foundations of the town, and these people, she believed, were a threat to that foundation. They were a rot, a decay, a foreign element that would undermine everything he had worked to build. Her grief had found a target. Her madness had found a cause. This internal transformation did not remain silent for long. Her obsessive watching soon demanded a voice. She began to speak. Her pronouncements were not made in the town square or from a soapbox. They were delivered like shards of glass, slipped into the quiet moments of the day. She would appear at the edge of the tavern yard as the men were leaving, their senses dulled by ale. She would stand there, a dark, motionless figure, and when one of the men would greet her out of a sense of nervous habit, she would fix him with her gaze and speak. She said the newcomers were not like them. She said they were vermin who breed in the dark, their numbers swelling with each passing night. She warned that they carried diseases not just of the body, but of the soul. Her voice was low and devoid of emotion, which made her words all the more chilling. They were not the ravings of a lunatic, but the cold, measured pronouncements of a prophetess. At first, the men would shift uncomfortably, muttering a hasty goodnight and hurrying on their way. They told their wives that the widow had finally lost her senses, that her grief had hollowed her out completely. But her words lingered. They echoed their own unspoken fears, giving a name and a shape to the resentments they harbored in their hearts. Her rhetoric was insidious. She spoke of the Irish as a nocturnal plague, a pestilence that did its work while good, honest folk were asleep. It was reported that she told Obadiah, the storekeeper, that their poverty was a sign of their inherent impurity. She said that God had sent a famine to their homeland for a reason, and that by coming to Rebecca, they were attempting to escape a divine judgment that would inevitably follow them. She claimed their children were not true children, but changelings, their coughs and cries a mimicry of human suffering designed to elicit a sympathy they did not deserve. To Pastor Theron's wife, Sophronia, she spoke of their faith as a dark superstition, a pagan ritual that would call down a curse upon the entire town. She said that their prayers were blasphemies whispered to a false idol, and that their presence was a sacrilege that would poison the very soil. Her words were a potent, venomous brew, mixing the town's religious anxieties with its social prejudices. She was not just articulating their hatred, she was giving it a theological framework, a moral justification. She was transforming their fear of the other into a holy war. The town, in its own way, began to listen. The men in the tavern started to repeat her phrases. Thaddeus, the farmer, was heard to say that the widow was the only one who saw the threat clearly. The women, gathered after church, would whisper her warnings among themselves, their initial pity for her now replaced with a kind of fearful respect. She was becoming the conscience of their collective animosity, the embodiment of their darkest, most secret desires. The question of her sanity was a moot point. Whether she was driven by a madness born of grief or by a calculated, malevolent clarity did not matter to the people of Rebecca. What mattered was that she was saying what they were all thinking. They saw her nightly vigils on the porch not as a sign of derangement, but as a necessary watch, a guarding of the town's borders against the enemy encamped just beyond the marsh. Was she protecting the town, or was she feeding her own private demons? The distinction became blurred, and eventually, it vanished altogether. In the closed, fearful world of Rebecca, the two things had become one and the same. Her personal obsession was sanctified as a civic duty. As the first frosts of winter began to silver the dead grass of the marsh, a subtle but significant shift occurred in the woman's routine. Her observation, once passive, became more active. Her fixation, which had been expressed in words and watchful stillness, began to harden into something more tangible, a nightly ritual that was no longer just about seeing, but about preparing. The creak of the rocking chair would cease for long periods. The moonlight would reveal not a seated figure, but an empty chair, its slow, ghostly rocking, a testament to the wind and the recent presence of its occupant. She had begun to move. Her silent, nocturnal watch was about to become a calculated, predatory stalking. The hatred she had nurtured in her heart and preached with her lips was now demanding expression through her hands and her feet. The town had forged its fears into a single, sharp instrument of hate, and that instrument was now ready to be put to use. The transition from muttering to action was complete. The time for watching was over. The time for hunting had begun. The descent into winter was a cruel, methodical stripping away of all comfort. For the Irish families huddled in their shanties on the edge of Rebecca, the cold was more than a physical hardship. It was an invading presence, a relentless siege against the flimsy ramparts of their new lives. The wind, sweeping in from the bleak expanse of the marsh, carried no scent of pine or hearth smoke, but the raw, metallic odor of frozen earth and decaying reeds. It was a wind that seemed to have a voice, a low, mournful moan that found its way through every chink and crack in the poorly seasoned wood of their shelters. Inside, the world was reduced to a primal struggle for warmth. Families huddled together under thin, threadbare blankets, their bodies a small, collective furnace against the vast and indifferent cold. The window panes, where they existed, were not clear panes of glass but thin, translucent sheets of greased paper which did little to keep out the chill and served only to smear the outside world into a landscape of indistinct, menacing shapes. At night, the moisture from their own breath would freeze on the inside of the walls, coating the rough-hewn planks with a delicate, crystalline layer of frost. The shacks were porous, not just to the cold, but to sound. Every snap of a frozen twig, every rustle of a nocturnal animal in the undergrowth, every sigh of the wind was amplified, becoming a part of the tense, sleepless atmosphere within. This was the world upon which a new, more deliberate terror began to impinge, a fear that was not born of the elements, but of human will. It began with noises, sounds so subtle at first that they could be dismissed as tricks of the ear, as the natural groaning of green wood contracting in the frost. Cian was the first to notice it with any certainty. He was lying awake one night, the small, warm weight of his daughter Una nestled against him, when he heard it. It was not the wind, it was the distinct, sharp crunch of a boot heel coming down on the frozen mud just beyond their door. One step, then silence. He lay perfectly still, his body rigid, his ears straining against the oppressive quiet that followed. He held his breath, waiting for a second step that never came. The silence stretched, becoming heavier and more threatening than the sound that had broken it. He imagined a figure standing just outside, listening as he was listening, separated from him only by a few inches of poorly fitted timber. He slowly, carefully, let out his breath. Una stirred beside him, murmuring in her sleep. He placed a gentle hand on her back, his mind racing. Was it one of the townsfolk, drunk and lost on their way home from the tavern? Was it an animal, a stray dog, or a deer? But the sound had been too precise, too heavy for an animal. He knew, with a cold certainty that settled in the pit of his stomach, that it had been a person. He stayed awake for the rest of the night, his senses on a razor's edge, but the sound did not come again. In the morning, he said nothing to Una. He told himself he had imagined it, but the fear had taken root. Soon, others began to hear things as well. In a shack 2 doors down, a woman named Brona, a widow who had lost her husband on the voyage over, was jolted from a light sleep by a soft, rhythmic scratching at her door. It lasted for less than a minute, a dry, insistent sound like a branch being dragged across the wood. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her 2 young sons were asleep in the same bed, their breathing the only other sound in the small, dark space. She thought of wolves, but the sound was too deliberate, too patient. It stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving her alone with the frantic beating of her own heart. A few nights later, Fionn, a man whose broad shoulders seemed to have been built for lifting stones, heard a soft thud against the back wall of his dwelling. It was a muffled, fleshy sound, as if someone had stumbled and thrown out a hand to catch their fall. He grabbed the peat shovel that served as his only weapon and flung open the door, a curse on his lips. He was met with a blast of frigid air and an empty, moonlit landscape. There was no one there. The marsh was still, the skeletal trees standing like silent sentinels. He saw nothing, but he felt a profound sense of being watched. He closed the door, his bravado evaporating in the face of the unnerving emptiness. These were not isolated incidents. The stories began to circulate through the small, besieged community in hushed, frightened whispers. Sleep, which should have been a respite from their hard labor and meager rations, became a nightly ordeal, a descent into a state of heightened vulnerability where every creak and groan of their flimsy homes could be the harbinger of an unseen, unknown menace. The terror soon escalated from the auditory to the physical. The nocturnal visitor began to leave a calling card. The families would awaken not just with the memory of a strange sound, but with tangible evidence of an intrusion. The first signs were small acts of disarray, calculated to unsettle rather than to harm. Cian awoke one morning to find the pile of firewood he had painstakingly chopped and stacked beside his door completely scattered. The logs rolled across the frozen yard as if by a malevolent child. Brona discovered the wooden bucket she used to carry water from the communal well overturned, a perfect circle of ice forming where the water had spilled and frozen solid. Fionn found the latch on his small rabbit hutch had been lifted. The rabbits were all there, huddled and trembling in the corner of their cage, but the open door was a clear and chilling message. This was not the work of a thief. Nothing was ever taken. It was not the random mischief of an animal. The actions were too precise, too imbued with a quiet, observant intelligence. This was a campaign of psychological warfare. It was designed to erode their sense of safety, to remind them that even in their own small, miserable patch of land, they were not safe. The intruder was demonstrating an intimate knowledge of their lives, of their belongings, of their routines. It was a way of saying, without ever showing a face or speaking a word, that the barriers of wood and distance were meaningless. I can get to you whenever I choose. I can stand where you stood, touch what you have touched. You are surrounded, and you are utterly defenseless. The discovery of footprints confirmed their worst fears. After a light dusting of snow, a young boy named Donald, sent out at dawn to relieve himself, saw them. A single set of tracks, leading out from the dense, shadowy reeds of the marsh, winding a deliberate path between the shacks, and then retreating back into the marshland. The prints were deep and clear in the thin layer of snow. They were made by heavy, worn boots, the kind a farmer or a laborer might wear. The stride was long and confident. The boy stared at the tracks, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He followed them with his eyes, a line that connected the dark wilderness to their very doorsteps. He ran back inside, his face pale, and told his father what he had seen. The men gathered, their faces grim, their voices low and angry. They followed the tracks as a group, a small, grim procession moving through the snow. The path of the nocturnal visitor was a revelation. The footprints paused for long periods outside certain windows. They circled Brona's shack twice. They led directly to the overturned bucket, to the scattered firewood, to the unlatched rabbit hutch. It was the geography of their fear, mapped out for them in the morning light. They followed the tracks to the edge of the marsh, where they disappeared into the thick, impassable reeds. The men stood there, helpless, staring into the shadows. Their enemy could emerge from the wilderness at will and retreat back into its depths, leaving them with nothing but the chilling evidence of its presence. The sightings, when they began, were like fragments of a nightmare. They were fleeting, uncertain, and primarily the domain of the children, whose testimony was easily dismissed by their frightened parents as the product of an overactive imagination. It was Una who first gave the specter a name. Awakened by a coughing fit, she had crawled from her bed to the small, grimy window of their shack. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, casting a weak, ethereal light on the frosted landscape. Una wiped a small circle of condensation from the cold surface and peered out. At the edge of the clearing, where the orderly lines of the settlement dissolved into the chaos of the marsh, she saw a figure. It was tall and dark, standing perfectly still, partially obscured by the skeletal branches of a winter bear willow tree. It was looking directly at their shack. The child felt a primal fear, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She scrambled back to her father and whispered that there was a lady outside. Cian, his mind clouded with sleep and dread, held her close and told her it was just a dream, just a shadow. But the image was seared into Una's mind. She began to whisper about it to the other children. The story grew with each telling. They called her the Lady with the Axe, adding a gruesome detail that seemed to spring from their collective, childish subconscious, a way of giving a concrete shape to the formless dread that had infected their lives. It became their own private piece of folklore, a bogeyman born of a very real and present danger. The children's fantasy was given terrifying credence by an adult witness, a young man named Lorcan, who had been unable to find any work in Rebecca, had walked for 2 days to a neighboring town in a desperate search for employment. He was returning after dark, exhausted and empty-handed, taking a path that skirted the edge of the marsh to avoid being seen by the townsfolk. The moon was brighter that night, and the ground was hard with a deep frost. As he neared the cluster of shacks, a movement in the trees ahead caught his eye. He stopped, melting back into the shadows of a large oak. A figure emerged from the woods, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. It was a woman, tall and cloaked in black. As she passed through a clearing, the moonlight fell directly upon her, and Lorcan's blood ran cold. He recognized her. It was the widow, the strange, reclusive woman from the house at the edge of town. Her face was like a mask carved from ice, and she was looking towards the immigrant dwellings with an unnerving intensity. In her hands, she carried a long object, wrapped in what looked like dark, oiled cloth. It was heavy. She held it with both hands, close to her body. Despite the wrapping, its shape was unmistakable. It was the shape of a wood-splitting axe, its heavy head and long handle clearly discernible even in the mottled moonlight. Lorcan did not breathe. He remained frozen in place long after she had passed. The image of her and her shrouded weapon burned into his brain. He stumbled back to his family's shack, his terror a palpable thing. He told his father what he had seen. He said the widow walked the night. He said she carried an axe. The whispers of the children were no longer a fantasy. The terror now had a face, a name, and a weapon. The question that had been haunting their sleepless nights had changed. It was no longer a question of who or what was outside their doors. The only question that remained was when the muffled sounds and the scattered firewood would give way to the splintering of a door and the sickening thud of sharpened steel. The whispers were about to become blood. The night that blood was finally spilled was a night of extraordinary stillness. The wind, which had been a constant, keening presence for weeks, died away completely, leaving a silence so profound that it seemed to have weight and substance. A hard frost had fallen, coating every surface in a brittle, glittering sheath of ice. The moon was absent, and the stars, scattered across the ink-black sky, offered no comfort, their light too cold and distant to penetrate the oppressive darkness that had settled over Rebecca. Inside the shack, belonging to the O'Cleary family, a fragile warmth was maintained by the embers of a peat fire, which glowed with a faint, pulsing light in the hearth. Eamon O'Cleary, his wife, Deirdre, and their two young sons, Finn and Sean, were asleep. They had come to Rebecca later than the others, a family that had missed the initial landing of the Stout Mary and had made their own way from a larger port city. They were less known to the other Irish, and almost completely invisible to the townsfolk, a fact which, in the twisted calculus of the predator, made them the perfect first target. Their shack was the most isolated, set slightly apart from the others, closer to the whispering reeds of the marsh. The woman approached the O'Cleary home with a patience that bordered on the reverential. She moved not with the haste of a common murderer, but with the slow, deliberate grace of a priestess approaching an altar. The frost-crusted ground crunched softly under her heavy boots, a sound that was absorbed by the vast, insulating silence of the night. She had unwrapped the axe, its head a wedge of dark, polished steel that seemed to drink the starlight. The handle, worn smooth by her late husband's hands, felt familiar and solid in her grasp. She did not go to the door. She had watched this family, as she had watched all the others. She knew its weaknesses. She moved to the side of the shack, where a single, poorly fitted window looked out onto the empty marsh. The greased paper that covered it was brittle with frost. Using the sharpened corner of the axe head, she made a small, precise incision in the paper, a careful surgical cut that made almost no noise. She put her eye to the opening, her vision filled for a moment with the darkness within. As her eye adjusted, the faint, ruddy glow of the dying embers revealed the scene. She saw the family huddled together on a single low pallet, their forms a mound of threadbare blankets. She could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of their breathing, a gentle tide of life that, to her ears, was an intolerable offense. She watched them for a long time, her own breathing slow and even, her body perfectly still. There was no rage in her, no frantic bloodlust. There was only a cold, clear sense of purpose, a feeling of profound and terrible rightness. The door was not barred from the inside. Eamon, trusting in the isolation of their position and the solidarity of their fellow immigrants, had never seen the need. The simple wooden latch was easily lifted from the outside with the thin blade of a knife. The door opened with a low, mournful groan, a sound that seemed to echo the silent scream of the house itself. She slipped inside, a shadow detaching itself from the greater shadow of the night. The air in the small room was thick with the scent of sleep, peat smoke, and poverty. It was the scent of life, and she hated it. She moved with an unnerving sureness in the near darkness, her feet finding a clear path around the few meager pieces of furniture. She stood over the sleeping family, the axe held in both hands, its weight a comforting, righteous presence. She raised it high, the polished steel catching a faint, demonic glint from the embers. Eamon was the first to die. The blow was delivered with a brutal efficiency, a downward arc of focused hatred that landed with a sickening, wet thud. He died without a sound, his sleep transitioning seamlessly into death. Deirdre, startled by the jolt of her husband's dying convulsion, began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, but before her sleep-fogged mind could process the dark shape looming over her, the axe fell again. Then it fell upon the children, Finn and Sean, their small bodies offering no resistance. The entire act was carried out in a terrifying, almost reverent silence, broken only by the sound of the impacts and the soft, spreading stain of warmth on the packed earth floor. The woman stood for a moment, breathing in the coppery tang of fresh blood that now filled the small space. She felt a sense of profound satisfaction, a quiet, clean feeling of a necessary task completed. She wiped the axe head on one of the family's blankets, slipped back out the door, and vanished into the impenetrable darkness of the marsh, leaving behind a silence that was now eternal. The discovery was made at dawn. Cian, on his way to the communal well, noticed that the O'Clery's door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the morning's first faint breeze. An unspoken dread, a premonition born of weeks of fear, made his blood run cold. He called out Eamon's name. There was no answer. He pushed the door open and looked inside. The scene that greeted him was one of such profound and quiet butchery that his mind initially refused to comprehend it. The family was still in their bed, but the blankets were soaked through with a dark, almost black wetness. The air was thick and metallic. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if they had simply allowed death to take them in their sleep. Cian stumbled back, his hand clamped over his mouth to stifle a cry, the bucket falling from his grasp and clattering on the frozen ground. His shout of horror, when it finally came, was a raw, animal sound that shattered the morning's peace and brought the other families tumbling from their shacks. The reaction of the townsfolk was a study in calculated indifference, when a small, terrified delegation of Irish men, led by Fionn, went into Rebecca to report the slaughter to the town constable, a corpulent, lazy man named Silas. Their pleas were met with a wall of bureaucratic apathy. Silas listened to Fionn's frantic, broken account with a look of weary impatience. He did not rise from his chair. He suggested, with a dismissive wave of his hand, that it was likely the result of a drunken brawl. He said that people like them were known for their violent tempers, and that Eamon had probably killed his family and then fled. When Fionn protested, insisting that this was the work of an outsider, the work of the woman they had seen stalking their homes, Silas's expression hardened. He warned Fionn against making such wild, baseless accusations against a respected, grieving widow. He said that if they could not control their own people, he would have no choice but to lock them all up for disturbing the peace. He promised to look into it when he had the time, a promise that everyone in the room knew was a lie. They were turned away, their terror and grief dismissed as the predictable and unimportant squabbles of a people who did not matter. In the days that followed, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The slaughter of the Eau Claris was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a campaign. 1 week later, another family was found dead in their beds. This time it was the Gallaghers, a quiet couple with a newborn infant. The method was identical, a silent, nocturnal entry, a swift, brutal attack with a heavy, sharp weapon. No witnesses, no survivors. The killings were always carried out on the darkest nights, when the moon was new and the cloud cover was thick. The targets were always those who lived on the periphery of the small immigrant community, those whose shacks were closest to the marsh, those whose absence would be noticed last. The woman's approach was methodical, her knowledge of the community's layout and vulnerabilities now undeniable. She was moving through them like a disease, culling the herd from the edges inward. The Irish were trapped in a waking nightmare. They began to barricade their doors at night, piling their meager furniture against the flimsy wood. The men started taking turns standing watch, armed with shovels, peat knives, and heavy clubs. They would stand in the freezing darkness, their bodies rigid with cold and fear, peering into the shadows of the marsh, listening for the telltale crunch of a boot on frozen ground. But the woman was clever. She was a hunter who knew the rhythms of her prey. She seemed to know when their vigilance was at its lowest ebb, when the exhaustion and the biting cold had worn them down. The killings continued. The question that hung over the terrified community was one of an almost supernatural horror. How could a single woman, a widow well past her prime, carry out such acts of brutal, silent violence? How could she overpower grown men in their sleep? The answer lay in the profound vulnerability of her victims. They were exhausted by hard labor, their bodies and minds dulled by malnutrition and the constant, gnawing stress of their existence. Sleep, for them, was not a gentle repose. It was a deep, dark plunge into unconsciousness, their bodies' desperate attempt to recover from the abuses of the day. The woman, fueled by her cold, singular purpose, was a creature of the night, her senses honed by her obsessive vigils. She attacked not with the frantic, clumsy strength of a brawler, but with the focused, efficient precision of an executioner. The first blow, delivered to a sleeping, unsuspecting victim, was always the killing blow. There was no struggle because there was no opportunity for one. She was not a warrior, she was an exterminator, and she approached her work with the chilling, detached competence of someone who believed they were cleansing the world of a pestilence. The sheets of their beds, soaked through with the lifeblood of sleeping families, became the silent, horrific testament to her methods. The silence of the nights in the immigrant quarter was no longer a peaceful absence of sound. It was an active, malevolent presence, a canvas upon which was painted a repeating masterpiece of quiet, methodical slaughter. The promise of the title had been fulfilled. The hunting had become killing, and the killing had become a ritual, performed under the cloak of a town's deliberate, complicit silence. The blood that soaked the earthen floors of the immigrant shacks did not seep into the conscience of Rebecca. Instead, it was met with a wall of silence so dense and uniform that it seemed to have been deliberately constructed, a fortress of denial built brick by mortared brick. The town did not react with the shock and horror that would normally accompany a series of brutal murders within its jurisdiction. There were no public outcries for justice, no town meetings to address the growing terror, no organized posses to hunt down the perpetrator. The official response, dictated by men like Constable Silas, was to not respond at all. The deaths, if they were acknowledged, were not classified as murders. They were relegated to the realm of rumor and categorized as the unfortunate but predictable consequences of the immigrant's own flawed character. When pressed by the few townsfolk who possessed a sliver of moral curiosity, Silas would offer a rotating litany of dismissive explanations. He said the deaths were the result of a sickness, a virulent fever brought over from the old country that caused its victims to bleed out in the night. This theory was particularly insidious, as it transformed the victims into the carriers of their own demise and stoked the town's pre-existing fears of foreign contamination. On other days, he would claim the deaths were accidents. A man, he would suggest, might roll over in his sleep and smother his child, or a drunken husband might strike his wife in the dark with more force than intended. He painted a picture of a community so steeped in chaos and ignorance that death was a commonplace domestic event. This narrative of self-destruction was amplified and given a divine seal of approval by Pastor Theron. From the austere sanctity of his pulpit, he preached a series of sermons that were masterpieces of victim blaming. He spoke of the wages of sin, and while he was careful not to mention the Irish by name, his congregation understood his meaning with perfect clarity. He described a God who was a stern and unforgiving bookkeeper, a deity who demanded an accounting for every moral transgression. The pastor spoke of the sin of drunkenness, painting a lurid picture of men who, under the influence of spirits, became beasts, turning on their own kin in fits of blind rage. He spoke of the sin of impiety, suggesting that those who did not worship in the proper way, in the proper church, had forfeited God's protection and opened themselves up to the influence of dark forces. He said their deaths were not a mystery, but a manifestation of God's punishment for a life of drink and sin. He told his flock that the tolling of the funeral bells from the marshland was not a call for their sympathy, but a warning to them, a reminder to remain steadfast in their own righteousness. The congregation absorbed his words, their own prejudices now laundered through the holy water of religious doctrine. They could look upon the suffering of the immigrants not as a tragedy, but as a form of divine justice. It was a comforting, self-serving theology that absolved them of all responsibility. The silence of the town was not just an absence of noise, it was a conscious, collaborative act of moral corruption. For the surviving immigrants, this wall of denial was a second, more profound form of violence. Their testimonies, delivered with the desperate, frantic energy of the terrorized, were utterly and completely ignored. When Lorcan, the young man who had seen the widow carrying the shrouded axe, attempted to tell his story to Constable Silas, he was accused of slander and threatened with a public flogging. Silas told him that his tale was a fever dream, the product of a mind addled by hunger and popish superstition. When Brona, the widow whose door had been scratched in the night, reported the incident, she was laughed out of the constable's office, her fears dismissed as the lonely imaginings of a hysterical woman. The survivors found themselves in a surreal and terrifying predicament. They were being hunted by a relentless, invisible killer, while the world around them insisted that the killer did not exist. Their reality was denied, their experiences invalidated. They were, in effect, being gaslit by an entire town. This systematic suppression of their truth was more than just a failure of justice. It was an act of psychological torture that left them feeling isolated, powerless, and profoundly alone. They were ghosts in their own horror story, their screams unheard, their wounds unseen by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The evidence of the slaughter could not be entirely hidden, however. It manifested in the most heartbreaking of forms, the small, plain pine coffins that the Irish men were forced to build for their dead. The sound of their hammering and sawing would drift from the marsh into the town, a percussive, funereal rhythm that was a constant, unwelcome reminder of the ongoing carnage. The sight of the small funeral processions, a handful of ragged figures following a crudely made box, became a feature of the landscape. The coffins were often shockingly small, built to hold the bodies of children. The town would watch these processions from behind drawn curtains, their faces impassive. The sight of a father, like Cian, having to carry the coffin of a neighbor's child, his own daughter clinging to his leg, did not inspire pity. It inspired a kind of morbid confirmation of their own beliefs. They saw the small caskets not as evidence of a monstrous crime, but as proof of the immigrants' inherent inability to thrive, their innate fragility. The bells that tolled were not the grand, resonant bells of Pastor Theron's church, but a small, cracked handbell that one of the families had brought with them from Ireland. Its tinny, pathetic sound was a perfect metaphor for their situation, a small, desperate cry for remembrance in a world determined to forget. The question of the town's complicity was a complex one. Was Rebecca actively protecting the widow, or was it simply protecting itself from a truth it could not bear to confront? The answer, most likely, was both. On some level, the townsfolk must have known. The sheer number of deaths, the brutal and specific nature of the killings, the persistent and terrified accusations of the survivors, these things could not be entirely dismissed by even the most prejudiced mind. But to acknowledge the truth would have been to acknowledge something monstrous about themselves. It would have meant admitting that a woman from their own community, a grieving widow they had once pitied, was a methodical, cold-blooded killer. More than that, it would have meant confronting the fact that her actions were merely the logical, physical extension of their own whispered hatreds and resentments. The widow was the instrument of their collective will. She was doing what many of them, in the darkest, most secret corners of their hearts, had wished for. She was cleansing the town. She was eliminating the threat. To condemn her would be to condemn a part of themselves. And so, they chose to believe the lies. They chose to accept the comforting narratives of sickness and sin, because the alternative was an abyss of moral self-implication that was simply too terrifying to face. They were protecting her, yes, but only because she was the vessel of their own sin. She was their scapegoat and their champion, their monster and their savior. This unspoken pact of silence created a suffocating, paranoid atmosphere. The town, which had once been united in its open suspicion of the outsiders, was now bound together by a shared, unacknowledged secret. Neighbors who had once spoken freely in the general store now exchanged guarded, knowing glances. The name of the widow was never mentioned in connection with the deaths, but her presence hung over the town like a shroud. She was seen more often now, walking through the town in the daylight, her face a serene mask of piety. She would attend church services, listening intently to Pastor Theron's sermons on divine retribution, her expression one of calm, righteous agreement. Her presence was a constant, unspoken accusation. She was the living embodiment of the town's murderous hypocrisy, and her serene public appearances were a form of psychological dominance. She was showing them that she could walk among them, a killer hiding in plain sight, and that she was protected by their collective cowardice. The town's silence was her shield, her license, and her greatest weapon. As the body count continued to rise, the line between ignorance and complicity dissolved completely. The community was no longer just a passive observer of the horror. It was an active and essential participant. It silenced the fertile ground in which the seeds of hatred had blossomed into a harvest of death. The killings continued, unabated, under the watchful, silent gaze of a town that had sold its soul for the illusion of purity. Then, one day, as suddenly and inexplicably as it had all begun, the killings stopped, leaving a vacuum of fear and unanswered questions that would haunt Rebecca for decades to come. The end came not with a bang, but with a profound and unnerving silence. For weeks, the immigrant community had existed in a state of suspended terror, bracing themselves each night for the telltale sound of a boot on frozen earth, the splintering of a door, the single, muffled scream that would signal another visit from the woman in black. And then, nothing. One night passed without incident, then another, then a week. The men who stood watch, their bodies numb with cold and exhaustion, reported only the familiar sounds of the marsh, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of a muskrat in the reeds. The oppressive, watchful presence that had haunted their every waking and sleeping moment seemed to have lifted, the suffocating blanket of fear replaced by a thin, fragile sheet of bewildered relief. But this new, unfamiliar quiet was not peaceful. It was hollow and resonant, filled with the ghosts of the dead and the lingering poison of unanswered questions. The killing had stopped, but the horror had not ended. It had simply entered a new and more mysterious phase. The discovery that explained the sudden cessation of the violence was made not by the constable or the pastor, but by a young boy from the town who had been chasing a runaway chicken. The boy's pursuit led him to the edge of the widow's property, a place that local children had been taught to avoid. He saw his chicken slip under the sagging porch of the old weathered house and, with the single-minded determination of youth, he followed it. As he crawled into the dusty, web-choked space beneath the floorboards, he noticed something was wrong. The house above him was utterly silent. There was no creak of footsteps, no murmur of a voice, no scent of wood smoke from the chimney, even in the crisp morning air. The back door, he saw from his low vantage point, was slightly ajar, swinging listlessly in the breeze. A strange, unnatural stillness had fallen over the property. The boy, forgetting his chicken, scrambled out and ran to tell his father. Within the hour, a small, reluctant group of men, led by Constable Silas, had gathered in front of the widow's home. There was no legal justification for their entry, but the palpable sense of abandonment and the weight of their own unspoken suspicions gave them all the warrant they needed. Silas pushed the front door open. It swung inward without a sound, revealing a scene of stark, orderly desolation. The house was empty, not just of its occupant, but of almost everything that would suggest a life had been lived there. The sparse furniture remained, the high-backed rocking chair on the porch, a simple wooden table and 2 chairs in the kitchen, a bed frame in the upstairs room. But all personal effects were gone. There were no clothes in the armoire, no utensils in the kitchen drawers, no books or letters or keepsakes of any kind. The house had been scrubbed clean of its identity. It was as if its owner had not so much fled as simply evaporated, taking all evidence of her existence with her. The air inside was cold and stale, smelling faintly of lye soap and dust. In the hearth, the ashes were stone cold, suggesting that no fire had been lit for several days. The men moved through the rooms with a kind of fearful reverence, their boots echoing on the bare wooden floors. They were searching for something, though none of them could have said what it was. A note, a confession, a sign of a struggle. They found nothing. The house was a blank page, its story deliberately and meticulously erased. The only object of any significance was discovered not inside the house, but outside, in the tall, frost-bitten grass that grew behind it. Leaning against the crumbling stone wall of the well was the axe. It was just as Lorcan had described it, a heavy wood-splitting axe with a long, smooth handle. The steel of the blade was clean, showing no visible stains, but a fine, lace-like pattern of rust was beginning to form along its sharpened edge, a delicate orange bloom that spoke of recent exposure to the damp air. The men stared at it, the final, silent piece of a puzzle they had all refused to solve. Silas, after a long, pregnant pause, picked it up. He declared, in a voice that was a little too loud, that it was nothing more than an old, discarded tool. He carried it back to his office and it was never seen again. The woman's disappearance became the final, dark chapter in the town's secret history. With her physical presence removed, she was transformed from a flesh and blood killer into something far more potent and enduring, a legend. Her fate became a canvas onto which the town and the surviving immigrants projected their deepest fears and desires. 3 dominant theories emerged, each with its own set of believers. The first and most prosaic was that she had simply fled. This narrative suggested that, having completed her terrible work, or perhaps fearing that the town's silence was about to break, she had packed a small bag in the dead of night and headed west, disappearing into the vast, anonymous expanse of the frontier. It was a clean, simple explanation that allowed the town to close the book on the affair, to imagine her living out her days in some distant, sun-scorched territory, her crimes unknown and her past a secret she would carry to her grave. The second theory was far darker and more violent, a story whispered primarily among the Irish survivors, but one that found a quiet, fearful audience within the town as well. This version of events held that the widow had not fled, but had been silenced. It was said that a small group of men from the town, perhaps led by Constable Silas or even Pastor Theron himself, had finally decided that she had become a liability. They had gone to her house one night, not as lawmen, but as executioners. They had taken her out into the marsh, the site of her own nocturnal hunts, and had administered their own brutal, off-the-books justice. Her body weighted down with stones and sunk deep into the black, sucking mud. There was no evidence for this, of course, but it had the satisfying ring of poetic justice. It suggested that the town, in a final, desperate act of self-preservation, had been forced to devour its own monster. It was a story that spoke of a secret lynching, a final, unrecorded murder designed to erase all the others. The third and most unsettling rumor was that she had been taken by her own madness. This was the story that the children whispered, the one that lingered in the shadows long after the others had faded. It posited that the woman, her mind finally and completely shattered by her grief and her crimes, had simply walked out into the marsh and had never returned. She had surrendered herself to the desolate, empty landscape that had been the backdrop to her reign of terror, her body swallowed by the quicksand, or her mind simply dissolving into the gray, featureless expanse. This was, in many ways, the most terrifying possibility. It denied everyone the closure of a clear resolution. It left her out there, a ghost in the reeds, a perpetual unseen presence. Her empty rocking chair, which remained on the porch for years, slowly surrendering to the elements, became a monument to this uncertainty. It would creak in the wind, a lonely, rhythmic sound that seemed to suggest she was still there, still watching, her malevolent spirit now permanently fused with the landscape she had claimed as her hunting ground. The town of Rebecca did not heal. A wound so deep, so infected with guilt and denial, does not simply close, it festers. The shacks of the Irish victims were torn down, their wood repurposed, the ground on which they stood left fallow, as if the soil itself was too poisoned to support new life. The surviving families, those who had not been killed and had not fled, were slowly, grudgingly absorbed into the lowest rungs of the town's social ladder. They carried their trauma in silence, knowing that it was a story that could never be told, but it was not forgotten. For generations, the descendants of the Irish survivors would whisper the story of the lady with the axe. It became a cautionary tale told to frightened children, a piece of dark folklore that held the deep, resonant truth of their ancestors' lived experience. They would point to the patch of empty land by the marsh and speak of the blood that had been spilled there. Was the woman real, or had fear, over the long, dark decades, created its own monster? The empty rocking chair, the abandoned axe, the unmarked graves of her victims, and the persistent, haunting memory passed down through the bloodlines of the survivors, all testified to the terrible reality. She was real, and her legacy was not just one of death, but of a silence that was louder and more damning than any scream. She had left an open wound in the town's history, a place where the past was not a comforting story of progress, but a chilling reminder of the darkness that can take root in the human heart when fear is allowed to become the law of the land. The record on the woman of Rebecca is now complete, and your presence through its final, chilling page is a testament to the importance of bearing witness. If you have just discovered our archive, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive so you are here when the next file is unsealed, and tell us in the comments how this story has settled in your mind.